1945 saw the lights go on again. Once more, the nation's capital was blazing in all its glory, and in cities throughout the nation, the blackout was ended. Germany had surrendered, the war in Europe was over. There was still a war to be fought to a finish in the Pacific, but that couldn't dim the celebration that marked the fall of Hitler and the end of his dreams of world conquest. 3 months later, crowds gathered in front of the White House, awaiting the announcement of Japan's surrender from President Harry S. Truman. It took 2 atomic bombs to bring Japan to her knees. But now Pearl Harbor was avenged, and the news triggered the greatest celebration the nation has ever known.
The victory of Europe in the Pacific led to the end of the war, but not the end of the devastation. Crumbling in Europe, the Nazi Party led itself to turmoil after the party's leader, Adolf Hitler, committed suicide in an underground bunker. In the Pacific, Japan tested its chances as the U.S. prepared to strike with its most deadly weapon yet, killing over 11,000 people in 2 concentrated areas in Japan with a single weapon of mass destruction. Although the U.S. seemed to see it as a turning point in the war had still not been won, and the security of a nation depended on if it did.
In late April, American and Russian soldiers met and shook hands at the Elbe River. The Axis armies began to surrender. In Italy, they captured and executed Mussolini. As the Soviets advanced to Berlin, Hitler committed suicide. On May 7th, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended the very next day. The Allies defeated the Axis powers for numerous reasons, such as Germany's location made it so they had to defend 2 fronts. Hitler also made some bad military decisions, such as underestimating the Soviet Union's power. The large productivity in the USA was also another factor. By 1944, the US was producing twice as much as the Allies combined. In mid-1942, the Japanese won a series of victories and controlled much of Southeast Asia and many Pacific islands. The Japanese then controlled the Philippines, killing several hundred American soldiers and 10,000 Filipino soldiers during the Bataan Death March. The Bataan Death March was the forced march of Filipino and American prisoners of war under brutal conditions by the Japanese military. Many Filipino civilians lost their lives during the march. After the battles of Midway, the United States took the offensive. The United States landed at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The victory for the U.S. marked the beginning of island hopping, which is an Allied strategy of recapturing some Japanese-held islands while bypassing others. The American forces were led by General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur began the fight to retake the Philippines.
For years, Adolf Hitler had forced the influence of Nazi rule on Europe. To the rest of the free world, his intentions were war, and brutality was his method. Populations were set in motion.
I came from Hungary and Germany. I have have seen many things firsthand. I was dreadfully worried about my family and all my friends, and I do not believe that people today realize how tremendous those dangers have been.
Next, we're going to talk about the defeat of Japan. As we saw in Iwo Jima, the Japanese would rather fight to the death than surrender. This produced the kamikaze pilots, which undertook suicide missions. They would fly their planes full of explosive into American warships. Next, we'll talk about the Manhattan Project. This was a project to produce the first nuclear bomb. After the nuclear bomb was successfully tested and was reliable, the Allies gave Japan an ultimatum. They said either surrender or face complete destruction and utter devastation.
Japanese troops had overrun Manchuria in 1931 and turned it into the puppet state of Manchu Kuo. There had been concern in the West over Japanese expansionism. This had increased in 1937, when the Japanese launched an all-out assault on China. But the Western powers were not prepared to risk war with Japan. This was even though Western warships like the American gunboat Panay were bombed by Japanese aircraft.
Well aware of the massive destruction that the atomic bomb is capable of doing, Harry Truman, President of the United States, used it as a weapon against Japan. He made this decision from discussing with his advisors. They informed Truman that it would be saving American lives. In Potsdam, Germany, Truman was meeting with Allied leaders. At the same time, they gave Japan a warning to surrender. It stated that if Japan did not surrender, they would be experiencing complete destruction and utter devastation. Unfortunately for Japan, they decided to ignore the warning, and the United States brought Japan destruction and devastation.
The home front gets behind the 7th War Bond Drive, symbolized in this statue of the raising of the flag over Iwo Jima. The same flag that flew over Iwo Jima now goes up in New York. With victory in Europe, all New York's lights go on again, and Broadway once again becomes the Great White Way. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the dome of the United States Capitol in Washington is illuminated, signaling the unconditional surrender of Germany.
In the year 1945, Japan was a victim of 2 atomic bombs dropped by the United States. The first one was on August 6 in Hiroshima. This devastating attack killed over 70,000 Japanese people and many more from the after effects of this horrendous bomb. On the 9th of August was the second atomic bomb attack in Nagasaki. August 10th was when Hirohito, the emperor, forced the government to surrender, which was something that had never been done before. Finally, the peace treaty was signed on an American ship in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. The victory over Europe and the Pacific was a big win for the U.S. and a monumental turning point in the war. Finally, after long, hard years, soldiers and families would be reunited with their families once again.
On this, VE Day, he reminded the free world never to forget those men who gave their lives for this victory.